All right, so get this. We're going to dive deep into something pretty wild today. Reincarnation and how it might actually connect to the Quran.
Oh, wow.
It's got a head scratcher, huh? But we're going to be looking at this article, Quran's Hidden Truth. Does Surah Al-Anbiya prove rebirth? And before we jump into all the details, it's super important to remember this is a sensitive topic, and we're just exploring what the article says, no taking sides here.
Right, exactly. And it's also really important to start with like a clear understanding of what Muslims typically believe happens after we die. The main belief is that souls face a final judgment and then they go to either heaven or hell. So rebirth isn't really something you usually hear about in like mainstream Islam.
So where does this whole reincarnation thing even come in? I mean, the title of the article is pretty bold.
Yeah, it is. It all comes down to how you interpret things. The Quran doesn't come right out and say reinformation, but the article looks at certain verses that some scholars and spiritual teachers see as hints about the possibility.
Interesting. Okay, so what about those verses? The article mentions Surah Al-Araf, specifically verse 7.25. It talks about souls going back to their Lord and saying, "Our Lord, you have transferred us from dwelling to dwelling." Now, dwelling to dwelling, that's some poetic language, right? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, it's where things get interesting. The word dwelling can be understood in different ways. Some scholars think it's talking about moving between different states or levels in the afterlife, like going from one level of heaven to another. But others think dwelling could actually symbolize physical bodies, so souls might live in different bodies over multiple lifetimes. What jumps out at you in that verse?
It definitely makes you stop and think. What strikes me is that the souls are talking directly to their Lord. It's like they're describing a journey, moving from one way of being to another. And if we think about reincarnation, it adds a whole new layer to that journey, right?
For sure, and that's just one example. The article also points out Surah Al-Mulk, verse 67.2, where God says he creates death and life to test you and see who would do best. Now, if we look at this through the idea of reincarnation, those tests take on a whole new meaning.
Oh, I see what you mean. So it's not just one big test at the end of life, but like a bunch of tests, maybe even challenges that souls go through over many lifetimes, kind of like a giant obstacle course to help us grow.
Exactly. And this ties into the idea of karma, the idea that what we do in past lives affects our current situation. Think about it. Your health, your relationships, your circumstances could all be connected to stuff you did in previous lifetimes. It makes you rethink everything you're going through, right?
Yeah, totally. It makes you see personal responsibility in a whole new light, too. If we're carrying baggage from past lives, it kind of explains why some people seem to struggle more than others.
And maybe it encourages us to be more understanding and compassionate towards those who are having a tough time. So are you ready for the verse that's like the star of the show in this article?
Bring it on. I'm ready for more mind-blowing stuff.
Okay, so let's dig into Surah Al-Anbiya, specifically verse 21.104. It says, "The day when we will fold the heaven like the folding of a written sheet for the records. As we began the first creation, we will repeat it. That is a promise binding upon us. Indeed, we will do it." Now, the imagery here is powerful, especially that emphasis on repetition.
Folding the heaven like a sheet. It's such a crazy image. It makes you think about how huge creation is and how everything might be part of this like grand cycle. And the fact that God's promise to repeat creation is binding, that's intriguing. What do you make of that?
It makes you wonder, right? Does this idea of creation being cyclical, of folding and unfolding only apply to the physical universe? Or could it apply to souls too? Is the repetition of creation a hint that souls might also go through a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth? It's a question that's been around for ages.
So we've got these Quranic verses that suggest this cyclical nature of creation, the possibility of souls moving through different dwellings, and the idea of God testing us across lifetimes. But then the article brings in the teachings of Sant Rampalji Maharaj.
Yeah, Sant Rampalji Maharaj is a spiritual teacher who gives us this like universal understanding of reincarnation. He connects it to different religions, including Islam. He sees these verses in the Quran as support for the idea of rebirth and uses them to explain his teachings.
And he doesn't just talk about it generally. He actually gives some pretty captivating examples of historical figures who he believes were reborn. Like he talks about Kamali, who was said to have lived a past life as a prostitute, but was then reborn as Rabia Basri, this famous mystic. That's quite a transformation. It makes you wonder, what does the alleged reincarnation of a prostitute into a mystic say about spiritual progress? Does it suggest a path to redemption through multiple lives?
It definitely brings up those kinds of questions. And there are other examples too. Sant Rampalji Maharaj also talks about Sultan Ibrahim ibn Ajam, a king who, according to his teachings, had past lives as Saman Maniyar and King Nashua Khan. And there's another interesting one, Sheikh Taki being reborn as a Brahmin Gangeshwar.
It's like peeling back layers of history and finding these hidden connections between lives that seem totally separate. It's fascinating. But before we go any further, we should point out,
That this is just one way to interpret these verses. It's not universally accepted in Islam, and we're just sharing different viewpoints from the article. We're not here to endorse any particular belief system, just to give you the information so you, the listener, can draw your own conclusion.
it's like a puzzle, right? Taking these ancient verses and trying to figure out what they mean in the context of reincarnation. But one thing that really stuck with me from Sant Rampalji Maharaj's teachings is his focus on the link between reincarnation and karma. It's not just about being reborn, it's about the why behind our situation.
Yeah, that's a key point. He's saying that what we experience in this life, the challenges, the good times, it's all influenced by stuff we did in our past lives, like some kind of cosmic domino effect.
So if I'm getting this right, he's saying things like our health, our social status, our relationships, even whether we're born as a human or an animal, it's all tied to our past actions. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it also gives us a new way to look at suffering. If we see our current problems as maybe consequences of past actions, it might help us face them with more understanding, even a sense of responsibility.
It's like instead of asking, why me, we might start asking, what am I supposed to learn from this?
Right, and it goes back to that verse we talked about from Surah Al-Mulk about God testing us. If we're always being tested and learning over many lifetimes, what does that tell us about the reason we exist?
I'm thinking it suggests that life isn't just about going to heaven or hell, it's about growing and evolving. Like our souls are being refined over countless lifetimes.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it brings up another interesting question. What happens when we've learned everything we need to learn? What's the final destination for a soul that's evolved past needing more tests?
Well, in Sant Rampalji Maharaj's teachings, the ultimate goal is to break free from this cycle of birth and death completely. He calls it moksha. It's about not needing to be reborn anymore and reaching a state of pure bliss and being one with the divine.
And that idea of liberation pops up in a lot of spiritual traditions. It's like we all have this deep down desire to escape suffering and find lasting peace.
It makes you wonder if deep down we all want that same thing no matter what our religion or spiritual background is. But achieving liberation sounds really tough. How do we even begin to approach something like that?
According to Sant Rampalji Maharaj, the key is to connect with the Supreme God, Allah Kabir. He believes that by devoting ourselves to this Supreme God and having the guidance of an enlightened spiritual teacher, we can achieve that liberation.
Now, before we get too deep into that, I want to step back for a second and acknowledge that we've been mostly focusing on Sant Rampalji Maharaj's take on these verses from the Quran. I'm curious, are there other interpretations within Islam that might see things differently about what happens after death?
That's a great question, and it shows how diverse Islamic thought can be. While most Muslims believe in a final judgment and afterlife in either heaven or hell, there are some less common schools of thought that explore other ideas.
Oh, tell me more. I love hearing about those less explored paths.
For instance, some Sufi mystics believe in the idea of fana, which is often translated as annihilation or extinction. But it's not annihilation in a literal sense. It's more about the individual ego dissolving and becoming one with the divine.
So instead of being reborn into a new body, the soul merges with something much bigger, going beyond its individual existence.
Right. It's a complex and mystical idea with different interpretations even within Sufism, but it shows that there are alternative ways of thinking about what happens after we die within Islam.
It seems like whenever we dig into these spiritual topics, we end up with more questions than answers. But that's part of what makes it so fascinating, don't you think?
I agree. It's a journey of exploration, and the more we explore, the more we realize how much there is to discover.
Speaking of discoveries, the article also mentions briefly that the Quran talks about a supreme God, Allah Kabir. And if I remember right, Sant Rampalji Maharaj ties this into his teachings about achieving liberation.
You got it. He suggests that this Supreme God, Allah Tabir, is like the ultimate source of creation beyond all names and forms, and that connecting with this Supreme God is crucial for breaking free from that cycle of birth and death.
But isn't the idea of a supreme God or an ultimate reality something that's found in lots of spiritual traditions throughout history? Like Brahman in Hinduism or the Tao in Taoism?
That's a great observation. The concept of a supreme God or a unifying force behind everything isn't unique to any one religion or spiritual path. It's a common thread that goes beyond cultures and history.
It's like there's this hidden connection between different faiths and philosophies, all pointing towards this ultimate mystery.
And maybe that suggests that different spiritual paths have more in common than we might think.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at how some people see reincarnation hinted at in the Quran. We've gone into Sant Rampalji Maharaj's interpretations and those captivating examples of historical figures who he believes were reborn. We even talked about other views in Islam, like the Sufi idea of fana. What does all this mean for you, our listener? Well, that's really up to you.
If anything we've talked about today has made you curious or challenged what you thought before, I encourage you to keep looking into it. Do some research, read different viewpoints, and most importantly, think about what resonates with you personally.
Because at the end of the day, the journey of spiritual understanding is a deeply personal one.
And who knows, maybe thinking about these profound questions about life, death, and rebirth will help you understand yourself and your place in the universe better.
It's wild to think that people have been having these conversations about life and death and maybe even being reborn for like centuries. It makes you feel connected to something so much bigger.
It really does, and even if we don't have all the answers, I think just asking these questions, trying to understand these mysteries, it can be so enriching. It can open us up to whole new ways of looking at the world and our place in it.
Right. We started this deep dive by looking at how some people interpret certain verses in the Quran as hints about reincarnation. Then we explored Satrapalji Maharaj's teachings and those captivating examples of historical figures who he believes experienced rebirth. We even touched on the Sufi idea of fana, which offers a totally different perspective on what happens to the soul after death.
And throughout our conversation, we keep coming back to these same themes: the cyclical nature of creation, the idea of souls being tested and evolving over many lifetimes, and the ultimate goal of breaking free from that cycle of birth and death.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. But I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is this. If there's even a chance that we've lived before and will live again, it changes how we see our lives today.
Absolutely. It makes us think about the impact of our actions, not just in this life, but maybe across multiple lifetimes. It encourages us to be more mindful, more compassionate, and maybe even braver in our pursuit of spiritual growth.
And it makes you think about those tests we talked about. If we're constantly being challenged and learning over many lifetimes, what does that say about the nature of those tests? What are we really being tested on?
That's a great question to think about. Maybe it's not about passing or failing like in school, but more about how we react to the challenges we face, how we learn and grow from them. Maybe the real test is about our capacity for love, compassion, and forgiveness.
Maybe it's about how we treat each other, how we contribute to the world, how we try to become better versions of ourselves, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of everyone.
And if the ultimate goal is to achieve liberation from being reborn over and over again, maybe these tests are designed to help us let go of our ego-driven desires, our attachments, our fears, ultimately leading us to a state of pure awareness and being one with the divine.
That's a beautiful thought. Our struggles, our triumphs, our whole journey through life could be leading us toward this profound awakening, a return to our true nature.
It is, and whether or not we fully buy into the concept of reincarnation, I think these ideas can offer valuable insights into what it means to be human. They encourage us to think about the deeper meaning of life, to consider how everything is connected, and to approach our own lives with more intention and purpose.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Quran, the possibility of reincarnation, we'll leave you, our listener, with a couple of final things to think about. If what we do in past lives really does affect our present, how would that change how you live your life today? Would you make different choices? Would you be more forgiving of yourself and others?
And if breaking free from being reborn is actually possible, what can we do right now to move towards that goal? What practices, what beliefs, what actions can help us reach our full potential and connect with that divine spark inside us?
These are big questions, but they're worth asking. And hey, maybe the answers are closer than we think. Keep searching, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.